Hi guys, welcome back. This is Module 54. Remember for homework tonight you should be doing Modules 54 and 55. You'll notice there's not a Module 55 video lecture. Module 55 is really short. There's not a ton of information in it, but it is still really important for you to look at. There just won't be a video for it, so make sure you take a look at your textbook. I'll also put I'll put my PowerPoint online and perhaps a notes outline for you to fill out in terms of what I think is most important. But tune in for Module 54. Okay, here we go. So learning objectives. After reading this module, you should be able to define hazardous waste and discuss the issues involved in handling it, and describe regulations and legislation regarding hazardous waste. Okay, so hazardous waste requires proper handling and disposal. So what defines hazardous waste? So let me rewind. We've been talking about municipal solid waste, and municipal solid waste does not include anything that is hazardous. Municipal solid waste are the non-toxic or non-hazardous materials that you're throwing away that can easily be put in a landfill or incinerated without too much consideration of anything else. Now, hazardous waste is waste that we are generating that has to be dealt with in a very, very specific way. And more specifically, we're looking at liquid, solids, gaseous, or sludge waste material that is harmful to humans or ecosystems. So the way that we define hazardous waste, there's 4 parameters that we look at, or the way the EPA, I should say, defines it. The first is its ignitability. Will it catch fire easily? If it's something that catches fire easily, it's considered hazardous. Corrosivity. So how corrosive is it? If it can cause materials to corrode or degrade, that's considered hazardous. Its reactivity. If it's not stable under normal conditions, it's considered to be highly reactive. That is considered hazardous waste. So something that's not stable under normal conditions is like nuclear waste, for instance. That has a high reactivity. And the last one is toxicity. Its chemical components are harmful or fatal when ingested or absorbed by the skin. There are many things that fall into that category, that if it comes into contact with humans, whether it's a small dose or a large dose, has some sort of, or contributes some sort of biological harm. Okay, so now that we know what we're looking at, where is hazardous waste found? So here in the United States, we produce about 38 million tons of hazardous waste each year. And really only about 4% of that is able to be recycled. So it's a very, very, very small amount that we actually do anything with. The rest is just hazardous waste that we have to find out what to deal with. And we'll talk about how we deal with hazardous waste here in a minute. Where does it come from? Usually it comes from industry, so big industrial processes, so textile production, cleaning machinery, manufacturing of computer equipment, even smaller things like dry cleaners, small farms, automobile service stations, things like oils. You're creating it in a much smaller amount, but it still exists. And then even household things like batteries and oven cleaners and lawn fertilizers. We create tons and tons, 38 million tons specifically, of hazardous waste each year. So the question is, well, what do we do with all of it? And why do we have it? So most of the time, most municipalities, most cities don't really have a way to collect hazardous waste. They don't come around every week when they pick up your trash, and they don't also pick up hazardous waste. Usually they say, okay, store it, and then there's 2 times a year that we're going to come out and deal with your hazardous waste. So they ask people to store it themselves, like motor oil, batteries, things like that, and then they'll periodically come and collect it. The problem with that is, one, people don't wait that long, right? They don't want to wait and store all these batteries for the once or twice a year that somebody's going to come out and deal with it for them. It's also expensive. You either have to pay to have somebody come pick up your hazardous waste. It's expensive to deal with hazardous waste, so people sort of turn their heads the other way, and they place it in all mixed in with their regular municipal solid waste, and it ends up in a landfill anyway, and that's sort of when we run into problems. Now, let's say it is collected. Let's say it does get collected the proper way. Once it's collected, it has to be treated. And basically, when we say something has to be treated, it means it has to be made less environmentally harmful. It has to be broken down in some way that it no longer is considered hazardous. It's no longer presenting a problem to an environment. Again, that whole process can be expensive, it's timely. And then once you've treated it, it still can't go directly into a landfill. It has to go into a place that's specific for hazardous waste. So they have these landfills that are specifically for hazardous waste landfills. They're incredibly expensive to manufacture. They have to be monitored way more closely than a regular landfill. And the amount of time that it takes for that land to become reusable, we said that a regular landfill has to sit and the land has to be reclaimed over the course of 10 years. One of these hazardous waste landfills, that land can't be reclaimed for 30 years. So it's a much longer time frame that land is no longer available for use. And then, of course, they always run the risk of something happening in that landfill and that hazardous waste getting out. So really the best solution is to avoid using things that have hazardous waste or create hazardous materials in the first place, right? Just to avoid that whole process. That would be part of the reduce of our 3 R's that we talked about. Reduce the amount of hazardous waste that we have so we can reduce the amount of hazardous waste we have to deal with. Okay? All right, so some legislation that we're looking at here. So this is legislation that was put into place to sort of regulate hazardous waste and where it ends up. So 2 that are important. This is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act is the first one, RCRA. And this was, again, designed to reduce or eliminate hazardous waste. This one's also known as the Cradle to Grave. Essentially, what this one is talking about is we are going to track any type of hazardous waste that's being made. We're going to track it from cradle, meaning from the birth of that hazardous waste, all the way to the point that it is being disposed of. And we are going to track everybody who's in control of it. We're talking more like large quantities here, by the way. Everybody who's ever touched it, where it's going, how it's being disposed of, is it being disposed of properly? It will be tracked for its entire lifetime, hence the cradle to grave sort of alternate name here. And the whole purpose behind that is to hold people responsible for hazardous waste. If you're going to create it, you'll be responsible for it from birth to end. Okay? And so that's sort of the whole thing. And like I said, you're tracking large amounts. You're not tracking like one individual person who put motor oil in their car, right? That would be ridiculous. This is people who are mass producing tons and tons of hazardous waste every year. That is the Cradle to Grave Act, or the RCRA Act. And the last one is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA, or what you will more commonly hear and how I'll refer to it as is the Superfund Act. And the Superfund Act is basically, it's a federal act that puts a tax on things like petroleum and other chemical industries. And that tax then gets collected and it gets put in this massive fund. And that fund is then used to support the cleanup of areas that have been deemed polluted by hazardous waste. So if you have become a hazardous waste site and the federal government has been alerted to it and is such a massive problem, this waste is such a massive problem that the federal government has to go in and clean it, then you become what they call a candidate for the Superfund Act. So basically they put taxes on these companies that have chemical and petroleum industries. The money that's taxed gets put into a fund for cleaning up hazardous waste sites. And I have to clarify here, this is only for hazardous waste sites that they cannot determine who is responsible. Because if they can determine who is responsible, then they will make that company or that person pay for the pollution. But if they can't determine who is responsible, then that's what this fund is for. And the Superfund Act, you're going to see where this is really important when you do your homework. When you talk about Love Canal, New York, it's a city that's really close to Niagara Falls. And you're going to look at why the Superfund Act is so important. Okay, so keep that in mind. So if they can't determine who the polluter is, then the federal government comes in and they have a fund. They have this super fund, this big pot of money that they can basically use to go in and clean up and reclaim the land that was once polluted by hazardous waste. Now, you can imagine there are many places that have been deemed places that have large amounts of hazardous waste or pollution. So they have this list called the NPL list or NPL sites, and this is the National Priority List. Okay, and this is a list of all of the places that have hazardous waste problems that nobody is being held responsible for, and that the federal government has to manage ones that are of top priority versus not top priority. And here's a place. The green dots are all representative of what are Superfund sites. And I will tell you, New Jersey has the most. They have 114 in one state. Now, notice there's one in every single state, even Alaska and Hawaii. And so New Jersey has the most. California's next, 98 potential sites in California. Or no, actually, the green dots are representative of sites that have been deemed Superfund sites and will eventually be cleaned up. 98 just in California, and then Pennsylvania with a close follow in 95. So you can imagine this fund is pretty large, and it is used to clean up these sites. Okay, now on a less large scale are called the brownfields. This is a similar sort of piece of legislation, but brownfields are contaminated industrial or commercial sites that may require environmental cleanup before they can be redeveloped or extended, but do not qualify as Superfund sites. That's important. So they are environmental, they're areas of environmental concern that have some sort of hazardous waste, but they are not a big enough problem to be funded by Superfund. So brownfields, but they have been listed as something that needs to be fixed. So things that are considered brownfield sites are factories, industrial areas, waterfronts, dry cleaners, gas station, right? All these areas that potentially have been exposed to hazardous waste. The problem with the brownfields program is it doesn't have the backing of the federal government. And so there's really no reason why these people who are responsible, by the way, they know who are responsible on this one as well. There's no fines, essentially. There's no legal recourse. There's nothing for not cleaning up a designated brownfield site. So people sort of harp on this one because it doesn't really do anything. It just goes through and dictates which places don't qualify for Superfund but need to be cleaned up. But there's no legal recourse if you don't clean up. That's essentially it. It's kind of a bummer. Okay, and then we're going to look, last slide, this is international consequences. So in the US, there's a really tight regulation on what we do with hazardous waste and how we dispose of it. So sometimes people don't want to pay for those fees to dispose of hazardous waste. They don't want to deal with the federal government. And so what they do is they put all of their hazardous waste on these boats, and they go to other countries and they pay them cash to get rid of it, right? Hey, we've got all this American dollar. Take our money and deal with our hazardous waste, because hazardous waste regulation in other countries is much less. So this famous example, this Kian Sea, it was a cargo vessel in the 80s, left Philadelphia with 13,000 metric tons of hazardous ash from an incinerator, and they were looking for somewhere to dump it. Some of it ended up just in the ocean. They just dumped it in the ocean. Some of it ended up in Haiti. They paid people cash in Haiti. Well, the U.S. government finds out about this, and they tell these people that the hazardous waste has to be retrieved from Haiti. They have to go get it back. So the boat goes back. They get all of the hazardous waste that they didn't dump in the sea that they ended up putting in Haiti, and they bring it back, and then it just sits on this boat for years and years and years, this big cargo ship in this dock, right? And then it moves back to the port where it initially left in Philadelphia, where they ended up just paying the money to properly dispose of this. And this all happened over the course of like 5 years. So it ended up costing a lot more energy and time to deal with it this way than it ever would have to deal with it another way. Okay, guys, do the homework on Love Canal. It's an interesting story. I promise the video is worth a watch. And let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.